Hey everybody, this is Chris from Prime Palette. I have a demonstration process video of a recent illustration that I worked on, the Floating Island. Some of you have seen this in the music backdrop that I use this for, and I want to show you how I built this illustration in Photoshop. So I have about 16 hours of footage that I've sped up about 7,000%. So you only are going to see about 10 minutes of footage, but in actuality, we're looking at about 16 hours condensed down into 10 minutes. So with that being said, what I'd like to do is play the video, and while the video plays, pause and take a moment to explain what is going on in the process of building this illustration. So let's jump in right now. Okay, so right here we can see this is the basic sketch. This is purely for composition. So I want to understand where each of the objects are going to intersect, what objects are going to be in the illustration, and by doing this basic sketch, I can then start blocking in heavier shapes. And the reason why I'm going to do this, let me show you. Oh, and yes, the sky is a great place to start for a backdrop. So I'll work on the clouds, I'll work in where I want some of those clouds to be, and I will use, generally, you can see over here on my brush panel that I'm using a soft edge for painting, and then every now and then I will use a hard edge as well too. But these are the basic round brushes that come listed with Photoshop. The only reason that I've dubbed them as Prime Palette Soft and Basic Round is I might have changed the sizes of these brushes. And for the basic round that has a harder edge to it, this one right here, I'm actually indicating with Photoshop that I don't want to do anything other than change the opacity of that brush. So I don't have any size adjustments based off of pen pressure. I am using this little Wacom Intuos art pad. Very inexpensive, about 60 or 70 bucks. You can get it on sale. I think it normally retails for about 80 or 90. And then I also have the wireless adapter for it, so I can use it without a wire being draped over the rest of my workspace. Okay, so clouds. Blocking these in. I'm using hard edges combined with soft edges. I'm not using any change in brush size based on pressure. The only thing that would change with pressure is the opacity. So here, what I'm doing is I'm actually blocking in the entirety of the leaves. The reason I'm going to do this is I'm going to mask in Photoshop this layer so that when it comes time to make adjustments to the leaves, I have them on their own separate layers. You can see up here on layer 5. And this is going to lend itself to allow me to, do you see that? I was able to block in the basic shadow for the leaves without interrupting any other part of the composition. So this mask is done entirely off of creating a secondary layer and then linking it to the layer down below it. There are plenty of videos online that will explain how to make this happen, the keywords that you want to search for when finding those videos, and I'll try to put one down in the comments down below as well, or in the description of this video, is masking. It's just a mask, a layer mask. So I'm blocking in the shadows, and then I'm making some choices. Looks like I'm finishing up the rest of this layer. Making some choices on where the leaves have deeper gaps between them. And as you notice, the farther they get to the edge or to the top, the more thin those dark shadows are. Versus down towards the bottom, this first shadow is huge, right? We've got a lot of shadow space here. This one right here is pretty big. but then up towards the top, they get really nice and thin. This provides that illusion of how a shape appears in real life. So things that are related to texture on a three-dimensional object get much smaller and much more condensed as they approach the edges of that object. Okay, now I'm starting to block in some of my highlights. Every now and then you'll see me use a blender tool to blend those out. You can use any sort of blender tool that you'd like. The one that I'm using within Photoshop is like an oil blender, so it has a little bit of texture to it. It's not just a pure blend. Looking in the highlights. Let's take a look real fast here. Do you see where I'm selecting off of the color? It's not a pure saturated color. The most saturated colors are over here to the right-hand side of the color picker. I'm going right in the middle. And the reason for this is because this object is in the distance. I want the colors that are going to be closest to the viewer to have those most saturated colors, but everything else, this mid-ground right around in here, is great for establishing a sense of depth with color. A little more highlights. Okay, I'm starting to block in some colored shadows. So the way that I use shadows in illustrations is that if the light is coming from outdoors, generally I want those shadows to be on the cool side, meaning I want them to be green, to be blue, maybe to be a little bit purple is okay. Purple's kind of that halfway between warm and cool, but these colored shadows also provide a lot of three-dimensional form versus just using black. If you just use black when you shade, when you shadow, you'll find that most of your work starts to have a very caricatured, cartooned like appearance. So if you want to strive for a little bit of realism, using some color in your shadows is a good way to accomplish that. Still keeping the values pretty low, right? This is not high up in the key color. This is still pretty down low, and it's also in the mid-range. Okay, let's take a second to pause and speak to what's happening here. So we have a lot of texture being added in over the top of the values that have been set. So it's good practice to start with the dark colors first, start adding in your highlights, and then the last step is to start adding a little bit of texture to that object. I don't want this to be super detailed because it is going to be in the distance. And you'll see later on in the illustration, I end up using quite a bit of color over the top of this part of the illustration to make it more neutral, to subdue it and add more depth between the foreground and the background. Okay, we're going to speed up through this because I don't want this video to be more than 10 minutes of your time. So we're going to skip forward quite a bit to right about here. Right, so we're starting to lay in the rest of the illustration. You can notice over on my layer panel that at this point I actually have two separate layers that I'm utilizing to keep specific parts of color attached to specific parts of the illustration, so that there is nice hard edges, nice clean edges between the tree trunks, the ground of this floating island, versus the color and value and shadow of the leaves of the trees. Keeping those separate allows me to have these very subtle variations between shadow be readable for the viewer. Most people will find that these tiny little variations, where I've got my mouse right here, between these colors are actually very pleasing for the eye only if they're distinct enough. It's very easy to blend these together accidentally in Photoshop or with traditional media as well. Keeping that nice clean edge is very, very appealing. Blocking in the rest of the ground for this floating island. Going in with my shadows, blocking in where I want stones. Okay, we're going to skip forward quite a bit to the rest of the foreground. So as you can see, let me see if I can pause on the section that we have. There we go. A little bit of a larger part of the composition here. So the clouds have come into more full form. They're still not finished, but I've also added a highlight that's general over the top of the entire floating island. This helps to unify this island, and it also helps to cement the idea that it is farther off in the distance. It's still reading as if it's pretty close. You might imagine that this is some miniature island that's maybe only 50 or 60 feet away. We will make some adjustments later on to make that played farther into the past, farther into the backside of the illustration. Okay, let's talk about process rocks, how rocks are utilized in my illustrations. So as you can notice, the first things that I do is I start blocking in specific lines of the cracks for the rock. What's important about the line is as the cracks get closer to the edge, just like we did with the tree, they generally get much smaller. Not always the case, but you're looking to segment the rock into specific parts. And then based off of those individual parts, you have to determine that there's probably 3 distinct values within each one of those components. There should be one that's lighter, one that's in the mid-tone, and one that's darker. Again, I'm using color in these shadows. I'm using like a dark kind of neutral blue, or I guess it would be a little more of a mid-tone neutral blue. It's not pure shadow quite yet. So let's keep looking and seeing how this rock comes together. All right, so starting to add in some of those darker parts of the shadow where I have more access to, or rather less access to the sun, to the actual light in the composition. I've indicated with the rest of the floating island that the light's coming from the left. So I'm making that consistent with this rock. Most of my light values specific to the components of this rock are on the left-hand side, whereas the shadow stays to the right. Okay, on occasion I do stray away from the basic brushes. This is totally normal for illustrators to do this inside of Photoshop, to not necessarily just stick to 1 or 2 core brushes. It's a touch of preference when you're looking through the rest of the brushes that Photoshop has included, or the wealth of Photoshop brushes that are available online. Keep in mind the most core useful brushes are those round brushes and the soft edge brushes. You might even end up with 2 of those round brushes, one that does focus purely on the opacity by pressure, and one that does focus entirely off of size but does not change opacity. There's a reason to keep those separate. The amount of control and flow that you receive from having those 2 types of brushes means that you'll have a stronger, sharper edge when you need it, and you'll have more blending when you need it. Doing it together can make it quite difficult for you to achieve illustrations at a fast pace. So keeping them separate is a good idea. Important to note, I'm not using any reference material for these. I am going off of my understanding that there are rock structures that exist in almost an infinite amount of patterns, and all of them follow generally the same principles of doing the cracks will help you indicate which parts of the rock are going to be facing towards light and which ones are going to be away from it. And then I'm applying that logic individually to each component of that rock. It does take a little bit of time to get it down. I would say each one of these rocks, especially the larger one, might take, an hour or two to really block in to make it look correct. Okay, we're going to skip forward a little bit here. We're already way beyond the 10-minute mark. So I want to show you backdrop. Okay, so this floating island now finds itself much more in the idea of being out in the distance. This idea will be further established by the rest of the foreground becoming saturated and detail laden. So once we have enough of the background done, then we can work back to the foreground and ensure that we have saturated colors that are still held together by a little bit of neutral colors in there. So what I've done here is I've blocked out the general idea of shapes and tone that I'd like to have in the grass. If we skip forward a little bit, we can see that I've blended most of this in. And now I've started adding in the texture of the grass. Where do I want the grass to exist? Now, that does not mean that you have to do this where you just start off with these very simple individual blades of grass. I was in the process of finding a technique and finding something that worked well for this illustration. In doing so, I did finally settle on this process here, which essentially is starting with that bright saturated grass in clumps first, painting a midground that reaches about halfway up to the grass, and then painting a darker color as you get closer to the roots of the grass. So by doing this, I end up with an illustration that looks like this. So we have these darker patches of grass that are not just to the grass, but the area around them, and they're pretty soft and diffused. That is not necessarily a pure accurate reflection of how it's going to appear in nature, but it does have compelling enough of an effect that it works for this illustration. So if we zoom out on the illustration in its entirety, here it is, completely finished. Things that I'd like to point out to you: the floating island did end up getting much more subdued. So all the work and all that love that I put into making sure that island looked good is partly obliterated by the amount of color that I've placed over the top of it. However, it was necessary to add the illusion that there's space between this foreground and the background, that floating island in the distance. There were adjustments made to the clouds. Keep in mind, effective clouds come from parts that are soft edges and parts that are hard edges. So this right here would be something in between. Here's a nice little hard edge there. Here's some soft edges. That is what creates compelling clouds. Thanks so much for watching the video. Looking forward to sharing more with you as I continue to produce more artwork and more music. Take care. Bye-bye.